I want teachers to know that they're telling stories all the time. It's not just, a goofy person with gray hair and a funny hat and, wow, did you ever hear the story about... No, all the time when you're teaching, you're telling stories like that.
Hello, listeners.
Hi there.
You might remember that voice you just heard from one of our previous episodes. That was Dustin, one of our guests on episode 37, Friends of the Podcast.
Maybe you recognized him for his very professional podcasty voice?
So podcasty. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense, right? Dustin is the host of another podcast called Sandman Stories Presents, in which he reads public domain folk tales from around the world and gently lulls his listeners to sleep.
It's quintessentially soothing.
So soothing.
But we're not here to talk about sleep hygiene.
Though that is important.
True. But to come back to today's theme, storytelling. When we started listening to Dustin's podcast, it really got us thinking about how reading and listening to stories from around the world can help expand our cultural horizons, build on our intercultural competence.
So join us in this conversation today and reflect with us on storytelling and cross-cultural understanding. Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Shey.
And I'm Anna.
Let's refresh our memory of Dustin and his teaching context.
My name is Dustin, he, him, and I'm currently located in South Korea, although that will change in a couple of months. I'll be going back to Michigan to teach. So currently I teach at an English village. It's a place for kids to come and experience the English-speaking world. It started many decades ago. In Korea, there were kids who couldn't afford to go abroad. So they're like, okay, we'll bring the UK and America and Canada and South Africa and Ireland to you.
Dustin has since moved back to Michigan and is settling back into life stateside. Big transition. Mm-hmm. He'd been in Korea for 15 years.
Yeah, that reverse culture shock is real.
Uh-huh.
So when we interviewed him, we wanted to get a sense in our icebreaker of whether he was feeling homesick. And we were also curious if he had encountered any cultural surprises during his time in South Korea.
You know, you are an American citizen living in South Korea.
Yep.
So you probably, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, you probably feel some sense of homesickness from time to time, even if fleeting?
Not particularly, but I do miss places that I've been.
Oh, okay.
So having moved abroad and lived a third of my life abroad, I get not homesick for my hometown, but I miss places that I've been. Like, I'm completely in love with Thailand. My wife and I have been several times, and we always have a good time. We always go to some certain places and have certain foods. I've only been one time, but I really miss Ecuador. My mom made friends with some artists there, and we went and stayed in their house and traveled up and down the coast of Ecuador. I really miss it. I want to go back. And just, I've made friends in different countries, and I miss the people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, home is, wherever you decide it is, right? And that can change periodically throughout the course of our lives. So,
sign of a true traveler. You can really build community and connection anywhere and yearn for those connections when you're far away from the people and places you love.
Yeah, we carry our homes with us.
And since we recorded this interview, listeners, Dustin's been peppering the internet with images of his travels back to Thailand. And I think by now he's fully moved back to Michigan.
Oh, good. I'm glad he was able to travel back to Thailand, and I hope his move went smoothly.
Me too. But beyond the countries he's mentioned, South Korea, Thailand, Ecuador, Dustin has connected deeply with many other places, even ones he's never been to, through his podcast, Sandman Stories Presents.
Here's a little taste.
Today we are back in Ghana reading more stories from William Barker's West African folktales. Morning Sunrise. A man in one of the villages had a very beautiful daughter.
She was so lovely that people called her Morning Sunrise. Every young man who saw her wanted to marry her. 3 in particular were very anxious to have her for their wife. Her father found it difficult to decide among them. He was determined to find out by trick which of the 3 was the most worthy.
That was episode 133 featuring folktales from Ghana. And if you were to continue listening, you'd get a really wonderful sense of Ghanaian culture.
My interest is piqued, and I'm ready for bed now. I kid, of course. So we wanted to find out how it was that Dustin came to be the host and creator of Sandman Stories Presents, how he got into storytelling to begin with.
Get into storytelling. Tell us a little bit about your amazing podcast and how you got started.
I've always kind of enjoyed storytelling within my family and within various places I've worked, but it really started kicking off when I was in my 3rd year here in Korea. I was working at they call it a hagwon, like an academy, an English learning school. They had given me a curriculum from Johns Hopkins that was, just wildly off. Like, I had the kids 5 days a week for a couple of hours, and I had 2 books that I was supposed to cover over 2 months.
Wow.
And that was just way not enough material. So I started going out to the used bookstores, and I got Piggy and Elephant stories, the Mo Willems series. And I started reading those books with the kids as kind of supplemental material. And that went well. And so I started building a collection of books here. And then my current school asked me to record some of the picture books that we were doing with the kids so that the parents could have it at home. So we put that up on YouTube. I knew it was going to get copyright strikes, so after a couple of years of it, we got the copyright strikes. I knew it was coming, but I was just doing what the school wanted me to do. And so I changed that into, what won't get copyright strikes? Public domain stuff. Okay, so I'm going to start doing public domain, and I love hearing stories from around the world. I love different cultures and all like that. And so I started bringing that into my teaching and into the podcasts. And one more experience way before that, when I was a student teacher, I was leading the class and I read Bud Not Buddy. And my teacher was like, wow, you're really good with voices and you're good with intonation and really making the characters come alive. And I'm like, oh, I guess I'm good at that. Okay.
You are good at that.
It's interesting to me that actually his podcast came out of his teaching. It was his experience reading stories with his class that led him first to realize that he needed to switch to public domain stories. And secondly, realize he was good at reading stories and making them interesting for kids and audiences beyond that.
Yeah, the world around us can influence our teaching, but our teaching can also influence the way we interact with the world, what we do, like starting a storytelling podcast.
So cool.
And then beyond just the storytelling element, we wanted to know about the cultural aspect of Dustin's work.
So what has been your favorite story or episode so far? And which cultures have you become, the most curious about or learned the most about through storytelling?
Which child is my favorite? I've enjoyed pretty much all the stories. Some of the cultures that I've become a lot more curious about, Philippines, learning a lot more of Filipino culture, which has actually got me in contact with several other podcasters from the Philippines or with Filipino backgrounds. And then, of course, Korea. I'm always interested in Korea. And then Nigeria, because with the Nigerian stories, a lot of them have references to physical places like rivers or mountains. And so I'm going through on the map and I'm like, what is this river? So I go through and I research and I find where that river is. And, the name is slightly different than what it was written down as. And so this is the origin of this river, as this story. So that's always fun.
That's so cool. And then I imagine that you take some of that research when you're traveling in that country and you say, I'm going to this river to think about, the origin of this story. And what a beautifully purpose-driven way to travel that could be.
Yeah. I was going to say a different way to travel almost. If you're not able to go physically to this place, you're able to imagine this place through this story with real geographic reference points, but also just all of these cultural reference points that come out through the folklore. That's really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of these public domain ones were before countries were entirely mapped out. Like one of them from Laos is the stories of Far East India. I'm like, but Laos isn't India. I'm like, no, back then, Far East India. Like, okay. So the West African ones are mostly from Ghana region, and the Nigerian ones are from Western Nigeria. And so they're fairly close, and there's a little bit of overlap as far as where the stories come from. And that's been really interesting. I haven't been able to visit either of those places, but like Anna said, going on the map and locating these things and seeing where these traditional kingdoms were and where the overlaps are, it's been really nice. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and you have a lot of episodes. So, I mean, you've really dug into a lot of different places, or at least added texture to those different places, because you will do multiple stories about the same or similar geographical region. And so I see you building that very textured and layered mental map of these places through that. Yeah, it's wonderful.
That's really what stories are about, isn't it? Traveling to other places, understanding their histories and people, even if we can't go there physically.
Yeah. You know, we've talked about building empathy and intercultural communicative competence and how we can help our students walk in other people's shoes, understand their histories and psychologies, and approach all of that non-judgmentally. I think Sandman Stories Presents is a great way to facilitate that process, to get students thinking about it.
We've also spoken about bringing diverse voices and stories into the classroom before, representation in the classroom. And I can see using Dustin's episodes as a listening comprehension activity and a way to bring in discussions of other cultures and experiences, especially in a setting such as the English villages where Dustin worked, where the purpose is to expose learners to quote-unquote foreigners. That's one way to suggest that foreigners aren't just American expats or other exporters of so-called mainstream culture. Learners and teachers alike can discover and appreciate a whole different culture together.
Absolutely. Stories are a great entry point for understanding others, and this can be especially important in primarily monocultural settings, such as Dustin described in his classroom in Korea.
With storytelling and all like that, I get the kids to think about what they're saying, think about why they're feeling, and have some emotional competency. Getting them to think about, why do you believe that? Why is that so? Why do you do this? And that helps them also see, different cultures are different. Somebody else is different. So one thing in Korea is there hasn't been a lot of immigration to Korea. There are quite a few ethnic Koreans from China that move to Korea because they can get pretty easy visas. But as far as people who look different or have different languages, they're kind of isolated at times and picked on and set aside. And so when I can get the kids to understand, they're really the same. They're just kids. They just do it in a different language. Because sometimes we've got kids that have just gotten off the plane and don't speak Korean. And especially in my area, I'm in a factory area. And so we have a ton of Pakistani kids. We have a ton of Indonesian, Kazakh, Uzbek, Russian, Ukrainian. We've got some Filipino kids, Vietnamese kids. And so they come in, and sometimes, their homeroom teacher doesn't know what to do with them because they don't speak Korean. So just kind of put them over there. But I try and get the kids to see, what do you have in common? You do this? Well, what about this? And through my travels and through the stories, I've learned some cultural things where I can say, this is the same as this. Oh, you've got this? Oh, they've got that too. And so making the kids comfortable and having them think about their own culture has been helpful.
I love that Dustin is really thinking about how to get his students to understand each other, and especially to tie in the experiences of his ethnically non-Korean students. And I appreciate his insights into young learners as well. Building intercultural competence from a young age can make such a huge difference. Kids are so malleable.
Yeah. And I can imagine using storytelling in so many ways for this. The kids could tell each other stories based on their own experience or family customs, and the teacher can model that, right?
Absolutely. One of our listeners, Anita, currently based in Eastern Turkey, shared how she tells her story when introducing herself to her high school and university students. She tells a story of how she heard she and her family were moving to America. She shares that she's from Indonesia and explains how when she was 8 or 9 years old, she was playing outside her family's house. It was nighttime. And she remembers how her mother came to her and announced that they were moving. She uses some role-playing of her mother's and her own dialogue for this. She steps to one side and says her mother's part, "Anita, we're moving to America." And then steps to the other side and says, as herself, "Okay, Mom." Her students usually laugh at this, just as you did.
It works.
Yeah. And what I like about this is that she's both making herself as the teacher more approachable and human, and also showing to her students that American citizens, all have a rich story, all come from a variety of different backgrounds.
And by telling her personal story, she's also inspiring her students to tell their own unique stories. We know that storytelling and writing about personal experiences is a great way to get students to practice language and celebrate their own identities.
Celebrating identities, yes. And I think that, especially in more monocultural groups of students, having students share their own personal stories can celebrate the differences among their similarities. If it's hard to see diversity in a group because students share the same broad cultural values, personal stories can bring to life the diversity of their family cultures and of their individual identities.
And beyond personal sharing, reading literature, stories from other cultures is such a helpful tool to learn about others and to inspire students to share their own stories and identities. One resource I've used for finding stories from different cultures comes from RITEL, which is the Rhode Island Teachers of English Language Learners Association, which, by the way, was my very first professional home.
Aww.
Shout out, RITEL. They have a great compilation of culture-specific book lists that students getting their masters in reading and TESOL created.
Nice one. We'll link it, listeners. Check our show notes.
Always check the show notes.
And thinking of the language learning component here, when students read a story from a different culture, they can then reenact it in a little skit in their own words to check for understanding.
Or they could write an alternative ending or predict the ending of a story.
Right.
And with language learning, there's often a lot of anxiety around making mistakes.
Yeah, it's a hard process.
Yeah. And so a few of our listeners shared stories they tell to help alleviate that anxiety. Anita mentioned a second story she tells us about when she was teaching middle school in Chengdu, China, and trying to learn Mandarin. In her story, she explains how she had learned the word for wife and tried to use it at a neighborhood restaurant to say, "Your wife is nice." Except the word she used was eggplant, which can sound very similar to the word for wife. So instead she said, "Your eggplant is nice."
Aw, that's a cute story.
So cute.
It always helps students to recognize that language learning is hard.
Yeah, it is.
Another listener, Joe, likes to tell a story he learned in Guatemala from his teacher Marvina, the story of bamboo. In his words, one time a farmer planted bamboo and watered it for weeks, but nothing happened, so he thought he had failed and gave up. Then one day he was walking past and saw that a bamboo plant had shot up meters into the air. That whole time, the plant needed to grow its roots first before it could grow in height. And his teacher told him that's how language learning is. You can't always see your progress, but you can trust that it's happening. And so yeah, ever since then, he's shared this story with his students around the world.
What a great metaphor for language learning, bamboo.
Yeah. Now, what's funny here is Joe admitted to us that he assumed incorrectly that his teacher had told him a traditional Mayan story. But in the end, Turns out it was from corporate America.
Yes, stories travel across borders just like people. As we've shared so many times, when talking about stories across cultures, building empathy is essential.
Right. And stories can really aid in building that empathy muscle. Students can discuss ways that they might empathize or not with the characters. I know you and I are always talking about our favorite books, and especially when we read the same book, we have different interpretations and empathize differently with different characters. And that brings to light our own positionality, our perspectives as we try to understand our different interpretations.
I think you're talking about our recent chat about the Immortalists, right?
Yep. Listeners, Shey recommended the book The Immortalists by Chloe Benjamin in our May newsletter, and then I ended up reading it myself. And we had some really great conversations about our different interpretations of the story and to what extent we empathize with each character.
Yeah, it was interesting. Our interpretations were very different, and through conversation, we broadened our understanding of different characters' perspectives. It was great.
Yeah. It was. So listeners, if you don't subscribe to our newsletter, we recommend you do. We share a lot of great reads and other media out there, often ones that get us thinking about other cultures as well.
Yeah. Our newsletter last week mentioned The Lowland by Jhumpa Lahiri about Indian American experiences, and another book by Clementine Joyful Wamaria and Elizabeth Weil called The Girl Who Smiled Beads, a memoir about the Rwandan genocide.
Oof, that's heavy.
Yeah.
But our newsletter is actually a good source of ideas for stories that adults and sometimes teenagers can appreciate. And it doesn't have to be a whole book. In the English language classroom, we need to choose what's manageable for learners. Short stories, podcast episodes, and the like are great for adults.
And for kids. Just be sure the content is age appropriate, right?
Of course. Know your audience.
One of my favorite resources for short stories is an anthology called Beneath the Moon by Yoshi Yoshitani. It's a collection of fairy tales, myths, and what the author refers to as divine stories from around the world. The stories are no longer than a page, and each comes with a beautifully vivid illustration representing the tale. I love using traditional lore to explore culture. And because some of the tales are familiar, they serve as a great jumping off point to look at different ways of telling the same story, how different cultures emphasize different takeaways, and so much more.
Yeah, I love how that includes images. You know, you could do a lot with having students just look at an image and interpret it and predict a story, write a story. There's just so much you might be able to do with that. And you know, along these folklore lines, you could also try a podcast episode from Sandman Stories Presents.
And for something more contemporary, I love to incorporate the tidbits of stories you find in advice columns or in the New York Times column Modern Love. Those really get my students riled up.
There are just so many great stories out there. Whether or not we use them with our students, we personally can learn so much. But so far, we've been talking about stories mostly for adults.
Yeah.
Dustin was kind enough to share some of his resources for introducing stories to younger learners.
For elementary school teachers, I would say, I think it's called the Riverside Anthology. That was something I picked up in undergrad. It was a book that goes through short stories, picture books, all sorts of youth-oriented books. Mo Willems is one of my favorite authors for kids' books. He's got a lot of stuff that has empathy and figuring out each other's emotions and talking and having it in a very fun and sweet way. Dan Santat is an amazing illustrator. Lane Smith is another amazing illustrator. Every month or so, I recommend 10 picture books. They're either storytelling or they're excellent pictures or there's something I really liked in it. And Project Gutenberg and archive.org both have public domain books for free. You can just download them.
Nice.
So I've gotten more folklore books that I can read at the moment. And yeah, they're always sources online as well, and there are people online. There are wonderful people on Twitter. I've found a lot of people through there that have been amazing resources. That's wonderful.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and recommend following you on Twitter because
Yes, check
my
out
Twitter feed-
at Stories Sandman on Twitter. Dustin posts such wonderful resources and is extremely responsive and kind.
Yes, do connect with him. That's at Stories Sandman. No punctuation. And of course, be sure to follow Sandman Stories Presents on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. His episodes are well worth a listen.
They truly are. But before you sign off and go listen to more of Dustin's beautifully crafted episodes, we wanted to leave you with one last thought that left an impression on us.
Right, yes. Beyond the intercultural understanding Dustin promotes through storytelling, he gave us an interesting perspective on how to view the structure of a class.
When I'm designing a class, I've been using the structure of storytelling to kind of structure out my class. I'm like, okay, here's the beginning of my class, here's the middle of my class, here's the end of my class. What do I want them to know at this point? What do I want them to know at that point? Using that has helped me structure my classes and kind of make my classes into a narrative. I try and make it where they can predict the next part that's coming. There's repetition. There's all this stuff that they can get through the class without knowing a whole ton of English and feel like they've learned something, and also they learn the content.
It's like you're taking them on this story, this journey through the class. Storytelling is a great framework for how we go about planning our lessons.
As Dustin said at the beginning of this episode, teachers are telling stories all the time in one way or another.
So, listeners, we hope Dustin has inspired you to integrate storytelling into your classroom, whether you're working with adult learners or younger learners, or learners somewhere in between.
And please tell us, how do you use stories in your classroom? What new ideas were sparked for you in this episode? How can you support learners' intercultural communicative competence through stories in your learning context?
You can share with us in a comment on social media or email us at teacherthinkaloud@gmail.com. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching.
And happy reflecting.